So there's been a bit of a discourse lately that's been brewing on a few sites like Twitter and whatnot over the last week or so, and it has to do with the nature of signposting in games, which naturally piqued my game design brain's interest to investigate further. Essentially, what kicked everything off was the demo for the latest installment in the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. A user posted this image talking about how the yellow paint virus has infected Final Fantasy, referencing how a lot of modern titles have been using random splatterings of paint, typically yellow or white, to help direct players as to where they need to go. And it seems like a lot of players are starting to get tired of this trope. Now, to explain, what this is a game design element called signposting, and signposting is a pretty self-explanatory concept. It is quite literally just any means of helping direct a player towards more of a game's content, the same way that you might come across a literal sign helping direct people towards a nearby town. Signposting itself can take many distinct forms. Something as simple as a mini-map with icons on it or a quest marker is a form of signposting that directs a player towards content using the game's user interface. But many games these days are trying to implement more diegetic signposting, meaning that instead of using a meta element, such as the aforementioned quest markers in the UI, they're trying to incorporate their signposting more into the world itself, using things like literal signs that exist in the world, or other techniques such as lighting the path you need to traverse, or yes, covering things in yellow paint, which brings us to the topic of discussion. Why are so many people getting upset at this use of yellow paint as a form of signposting? Well, first things first, there is one argument that I've seen that I think is mostly a straw man argument, or at the very least I hope it is, which is that some people are just saying that signposting as a concept is overly handholdy and players should have to actually explore and understand their environment to progress instead of having the game tell you where to go so explicitly. Now, the reason why I hope that this is not a real argument that people are making is because nearly every game worth its salt has signposting in it. Something as simple as how Mario starts on the left side of the screen and faces towards the right is a form of signposting that tells the player which direction they need to go in order to progress. The fact of the matter is that most games need to have signposting in them to help direct players as to where they need to go, especially as games grow more complex and detailed and the way forwards becomes less and less inherently obvious. And also keep in mind, signposting isn't always just about directions. It can also be used to denote things like what you can and cannot interact with in a level, like how in Half-Life 2, all of the boxes with actual supplies in them are designed to be extremely unique in shape to help differentiate them from all the other generic breakable crates in the game, so that the player doesn't have to waste time breaking every box they come across hoping that it'll have supplies in it. Stuff like that is still technically a form of signposting. However, despite how absurd the idea of removing all forms of signposting from a game is, that is not to say that the people decrying the use of yellow paint are necessarily wrong. There is clearly an issue here that needs to be addressed, and I think that Sam Winkler, a narrative director at Gearbox, put it best. Inevitably, in almost any given game, players will need to be handled at some point, but they don't want to know that they're being handled. Essentially what he's getting at is that signposting absolutely always needs to be in a game. Anyone who has done any amount of playtesting can confirm how frustrating it can be to watch a new player have absolutely no idea where to go in your level. But people don't like having their hand held. They want to feel like they figured out the path forwards themselves, even though usually they'll end up needing some help along the way. The ultimate lesson here is that ideally, signposting needs to be something that is simultaneously obvious while also being something that is invisible so that the player doesn't even realize that they're being led around by the designers. Now, that might sound like a paradox, but I think that this is actually very similar in concept to things like how good tutorials are designed, or even how good CGI is used in a movie. If you watch channels like Corridor Digital or any other visual effects artists, then you're probably familiar with the term of the best CGI is invisible. Lots of people decry the use of CGI in movies because it makes things look fake, but that's because the only CGI you recognize is bad CGI, whereas the best CGI blends into a scene seamlessly to avoid pulling you out of a movie. Similarly, in games, people don't like having to read a million text boxes or look at one of these dumb controller charts for a tutorial. If you've watched stuff like Aaron's Sequelitis on Mega Man X, or the 1.5 million video essays about Super Mario 1-1, then you've no doubt been familiarized with this concept of an invisible tutorial that teaches the player naturally through gameplay without even making the player realize that they're being taught. So essentially the heart of the issue is, how do we direct players with invisible signposts while still making sure that the signs themselves are obvious enough for everyone to see? It's a delicate balance to achieve. When the signposts are too obvious, you get yellow paint and its contemporaries, where everyone just sees it as blatant handholding. But if it's too subtle, then you risk lots of players getting lost and missing out on content, if not just entirely dropping the game altogether. Well, that's the thing. This isn't actually an argument about signposting. Many people think it's about signposting. I originally thought it was about signposting. But in reality, what's actually being discussed here is the nature of being
verisimilitudinous. That doesn't mean real, that means a plausible simulation of real. You know it's fake, but it feels acceptable. You can buy in. You can suspend disbelief.
Oh yes, thank you, Dan Olson. But yeah, it's that. The issue people have with yellow paint isn't that it's just a form of signposting. It's that it isn't a verisimilitudinous form of signposting. It doesn't feel like it fits in the world that is being established by the game. Having all of these random handholds and other markings just so happen to be covered in the same yellow paint just looks weird and out of place without some kind of justification. Like, let's compare this to some other games, such as Valve's catalog with Half-Life and Portal, which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, most of Valve's games include developer commentaries that can be a great way to learn some game design fundamentals for those of you that are interested. But one thing that gets brought up a lot in some of these discussions is how they direct players throughout their games. A very common technique that they like to use is to place the player in a darker environment and then use light to direct the player to the path forwards. There's a million ways to justify a simple light source existing in the environment, so it almost never feels strange or out of place. Sure, having only a single street lamp working might seem weird in the real world, but in a post-apocalyptic setting like Half-Life, where everything is run down and decrepit, it makes sense that the player doesn't question it. But they use lots of much more obvious and explicit forms of signposting too. For example, I've seen some people bring up how blatant some of the graffiti in Portal is, with literal arrows pointing the player towards hidden content because playtesters kept on missing it. But there's two interesting points to be made about this. For one, like I said, I think that this feels a lot more verisimilitudinous because it's immediately understandable that another human being left these messages, because you're walking through a test chamber that clearly other people have gone through. So it adds to the story that you aren't the first test subject to go through these trials, and there might have been many, many more people before you who have lost their minds in these chambers. Of course, people would leave graffiti in that circumstance, especially if they found something that they want future test subjects to try and find as well. But the second thing that I find interesting and kinda hilarious when people talk about Portal signposting is that they rarely talk about the actual main test chamber levels themselves. Like, you cannot get much more explicitly signposted than you do in Portal's fundamental level design. Every chamber is a featureless white room with almost nothing to interact with beyond the relevant puzzle elements like buttons and cubes. Every button has an explicit label on it with a dotted line directing you to what puzzle element it interacts with. Every level's exit door is explicitly designed and labeled the exact same way to ensure that the player knows exactly where the goal of each level is and what needs to be done to unlock it. I mean, hell, there is a literal gigantic 10-foot tall glowing sign at the start of every level that tells you what every element you have to interact with will be for that level. And yet, I've seen almost nobody involved in this discourse, even when explicitly talking about Portal, ever bring this up. And why is that? Because Portal explicitly takes place in a setting where you're navigating artificially created test chambers created by humans for other humans to navigate and solve. If you took Portal's test chamber signposting and put it in virtually any other game, then yeah, it would be just as, if not far more, blatantly handholdy and out of place as some people claim yellow paint is, but because of the setting that is established for Portal, these puzzle elements work perfectly fine as a means of directing the player to where they need to go and what they can and cannot interact with. This is also why, whenever you finally break free of the test chambers in Portal, suddenly all of the explicit puzzle element signposting completely disappears, because it would no longer make any sense for these elements to exist outside of the test chambers. Thus, the game shifts towards much more relatively subtle forms of signposting, like using the aforementioned method of having light sources direct the player instead. Essentially, the main takeaway, in my opinion, is that signposting can be as blatantly obvious as you want as a designer, but only if it makes sense in the world that you establish. Otherwise, you risk breaking that precious verisimilitudinous that causes the player to question your level design or otherwise break their suspension of disbelief. To try and bring this discussion towards a close, another example I really want to talk about is how Half-Life 2 literally also uses yellow paint as a form of signposting too, but it does so in such a way that I don't think anyone complains about. There are a variety of caches with extra ammo and healing items strewn throughout the game, but they're always marked by these spray-painted yellow lambda symbols. So, oh no, they're using yellow paint, that means it's terrible, right? Well, that's the thing. The game provides context for their existence. In Half-Life 2, you were literally traversing a secret underground railroad for refugees trying to escape from the Combine. Thus, it's understandable that they would use some sort of thieves' cant style symbology to try and denote secret caches of supplies for other travelers. It's implied that dozens, if not hundreds of other people have used this railroad before Gordon, and you encounter tons of people that are still actively maintaining it as you make the journey yourself. So of course they've left signs and supplies to help each other out along the way. So that just goes to show that given the right context, even the dreaded yellow paint itself can be used as an effective means of signposting without making it feel too handholdy or like it's breaking the player's immersion. I mean, to use one more direct example, Horizon Forbidden West also highlights every single ledge and climbable object with a bright yellow marking. But again, the difference is that in Horizon, the main character, Aloy, has a magic iPhone earpiece that can project augmented reality holograms over her vision. So naturally, she simply programmed it to highlight ledges like this to help her out on her journeys. So yeah, ultimately, the core of this whole issue is really more about the fact that more and more games are trying to implement more diegetic gameplay elements. You know, stuff like how every element of Dead Space's UI is meant to be justified in-universe. But some developers seem to struggle with implementing certain elements like signposting into their game's universe seamlessly. And to be fair, I think I do prefer to be guided by the game's level design and art assets more than a simple compass or minimap, but if your signposts are going to be as blatantly obvious and out of place as just highlighting every interactable object with random unjustified yellow paint splatters or something to that effect, then maybe you might as well just make it a part of the game's UI instead, as that might be less immersive breaking than trying to eat your cake and have it too. After all, there are also plenty of really simple signposting techniques that still don't rely on stuff like minimaps, while also trying to not be diegetic. Things like how in some games you can simply hit a button to automatically rotate the camera in the direction that you're meant to go, or maybe a different button that highlights every interactable object on screen for a few seconds. These sorts of things, in my opinion, work really well to help guide players that are stuck, and it's a technique that simultaneously isn't trying to be diegetic while also avoiding cluttering the screen with excess permanent UI elements. It's available at all times for anyone that might get stuck at any part of a game, while also being completely invisible and unnecessary so that players that don't get stuck aren't forced to use them. Ultimately, I do understand why so many games use yellow paint. It's really simple, effective, and easy to implement, and you want your game to be completable by as many people as possible, so you're going to want to minimize the amount of time that any given player might be lost or not know what to do, and really, at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. Like, I don't think anyone is actively going to avoid a game like Resident Evil 4 or Final Fantasy VII just because it has yellow paint in it. And if you're unable to get the time or resources to implement something better, then typically you're going to want to lean a little bit more on the handholdy side of things, since that's going to help out more players than it's going to annoy. But I do think it is also completely fair to call games out for having poorly implemented diegetic signposting, in the same way that people call out games for having overly handholdy, unskippable tutorials. It is something worth critiquing that could be done a lot better, and if nobody says anything, then developers won't have any reason to try and improve their techniques. So yeah, thank you all for watching, and as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. What's your stance on the whole yellow paint debate? Do you think I'm right in saying that it's less about the nature of signposting and more about how well integrated the signposting is in the game's world? Or do you think it's something else? Feel free to let me know. And if you liked what you saw, remember to leave me a like, and if you want to see me make more videos like this, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified of when I make more videos in the future. And if you really want to help the channel grow, then you can become a member or donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.